Have you ever felt that sinking feeling when the road ahead disappears into a wall of white and you realize you're completely alone in the world? Hello everyone. I hope you're all doing well and feeling cozy today. I want to share a story that still keeps me up at night. A memory of a drive home that turned into a living nightmare in the middle of a remote, snowy town. It started like any other business trip. Just a routine meeting with a client. But the weather had much darker plans for me than just a little bit of winter frost. As I sat in my warm car, I had no idea that I was about to face a psychological terror that would make me question my own sanity and the very reality of the world. The blizzard hit without warning, turning the rural highway into a treacherous path of ice and blinding sheets of snow. One moment I could see the taillights of a truck in the distance, and the next, there was nothing but an oppressive, swirling void. My wipers were struggling to keep up, screeching against the glass as they pushed away the heavy accumulation. Every mile felt like an eternity, and my knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. I knew I couldn't stay on this road much longer without risking a serious accident or getting stranded in the middle of nowhere. So I started looking for a place to stay. My phone was my only lifeline, but the signal was weak and flickering in and out as the storm intensified. I tried every hotel app I had, searching for a warm bed in any nearby town. But the results were disheartening. Because of the massive storm, every single room within a 50-mile radius was already fully booked by other stranded travelers. Desperation began to set in as I realized I might have to spend the night in my car, slowly freezing as the temperature plummeted. Just as I was about to give up hope, I found a listing for a small, isolated cabin rental that seemed to have one last vacancy. I booked it immediately, not even checking the price or the reviews. As the wind began to rock my car from side to side, the GPS took me off the main highway and onto a narrow, unpaved road that wound deep into the heart of a silent forest. The tall pine trees stood like frozen sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, closing in on me as I drove further away from civilization. There were no streetlights here, and the only thing I could see was what my headlights managed to cut through in the swirling white chaos. It felt like I was driving into another dimension, one where time and logic no longer applied. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked exactly like the photo online, but the atmosphere was far more unsettling in person. It sat alone in the middle of a vast, flat snowy landscape, surrounded by a ring of dark trees that seemed to be watching the house. There were no other buildings in sight, and no tire tracks in the snow other than the ones I was currently making. The cabin itself was made of dark wood that looked almost black against the stark white ground. I felt a sudden urge to turn around and keep driving. But the storm was now a full-blown hurricane of ice, and I had no choice. Stepping out of the car, the cold hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs instantly. I fumbled with the lockbox on the porch, my fingers numb and clumsy, until I finally heard the satisfying click of the door opening. The inside of the cabin was freezing and smelled of old dust and dry cedar, as if no one had stepped foot inside for many years. I quickly turned on the lights, but the dim yellow bulbs did little to chase away the deep shadows lurking in the corners of the room. I felt like an intruder in a place that had long been abandoned by the living world. I tried to settle in, starting a small fire in the hearth to ward off the encroaching chill that seemed to seep through the walls. The silence of the cabin was heavy, broken only by the occasional groan of the wood as it settled and the howling wind outside. I made myself a cup of tea with the supplies I had in my bag, trying to convince myself that I was safe and lucky to have found shelter. However, a strange feeling of being watched began to crawl up my spine. making the hair on my neck stand on end. I kept glancing at the windows, but all I could see was my own reflection. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the loud, rhythmic honking of my car alarm echoing through the empty landscape. My heart leaped into my throat as I jumped up, wondering if a branch had fallen on the vehicle or if the wind was just that strong. I hurried to the window, cupping my hands against the glass to see outside through the thick, swirling snow. The lights of my car were flashing frantically, illuminating the white ground in rhythmic bursts of orange. For a split second, I saw something that made my blood run cold and my heart stop in its tracks for a long moment. Standing about 50 yards away from the cabin, near the edge of the dark tree line, was the tall figure of a man. He was perfectly still, seemingly unaffected by the freezing wind or the blinding snow that was whipping around him. He didn't have a coat on, just dark clothing that made him look like a shadow cut out from the night itself. I stared, blinking my eyes and hoping it was just an optical illusion caused by the storm and my own exhaustion. But when the car alarm finally cut off, the figure was gone, vanished as if he had never been there at all. I stood there for a long time, my breath fogging the glass, waiting for the figure to reappear or for some other sign of life. My mind raced with logical explanations, telling me it was just a strange tree trunk or a trick of the shifting shadows. But deep down, I knew what I saw, and the stillness of the figure had been far too human to be anything else. I checked the locks on the door 3 times, making sure the deadbolt was firmly in place, and pulled the heavy curtains shut. I didn't want to look out into that white abyss anymore, fearing what might be looking back. I tried to lie down on the small sofa near the fire, wrapping myself in a thick wool blanket. But sleep was a distant dream. Every sound outside became a potential threat: the tapping of a branch, the whistle of the wind, the settling of the roof. I found myself holding my breath, listening for the sound of footsteps on the wooden porch. But there was only the storm. I wondered if there was someone else out there, another stranded traveler who was looking for help or something far more sinister. The isolation was starting to play tricks on my mind, magnifying my fear. Just as I was finally starting to drift into a light, uneasy sleep, I heard it. A slow, deliberate knock on the window right behind my head. It wasn't the sound of a branch or the wind. It was the distinct sound of knuckles hitting the glass in a rhythmic pattern. My eyes snapped open, and I froze, unable to move as terror washed over me like a wave of ice water. The knocking stopped, followed by a long silence. And then it happened again. Softer this time, as if someone was testing the strength of the glass. I didn't dare move, fearing that any sound would give away my position. I eventually gathered the courage to grab a heavy fireplace poker and approach the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pulled the curtain back just an inch, expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. But there was nothing there. The snow was falling even harder now, creating a wall of white that obscured everything beyond a few feet. I looked down at the windowsill, and my heart nearly stopped again. There, in the fresh accumulation of snow on the outer ledge, were the clear imprints of fingers, as if someone had been clinging to the side of the house. I retreated to the center of the room, keeping the poker held tight in my trembling hands, feeling completely trapped. I realized then that I wasn't just imagining things. There was someone, or something, out there in the storm with me. The thought of a person surviving out in those sub-zero temperatures without shelter was impossible. Yet the evidence was right there. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind, if the stress of the drive and the isolation were causing me to hallucinate. I felt like a character in a horror movie, waiting for the inevitable moment when the monster breaks in. The rest of the night was a blur of high-tension silence and sudden, terrifying bursts of activity that kept me on the edge. I would hear the car alarm go off for a few seconds before silencing itself, or the sound of something heavy dragging across the porch. I even thought I heard a muffled voice whispering my name from the other side of the wall. But it was gone before I could be sure. I paced the small room, checking the locks over and over, my eyes wide and bloodshot from the lack of rest. I had never felt so vulnerable and alone in my entire life as I did then. At one point, I gathered enough courage to peek through the front door's small peephole, hoping to see the morning sun. Instead, I saw a trail of deep footprints in the fresh snow, leading from the woods directly to the front door of the cabin. They didn't lead back away from the house. They just stopped right at the threshold, as if someone was standing right on the other side of the wood. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps, waiting for the door handle to turn. But the handle remained still, and no one tried to force their way inside the cabin. The psychological weight of the situation was becoming unbearable, and I started to talk to myself just to hear a human voice. I tried to convince myself that it was just a local prankster, or perhaps a very persistent neighbor checking on the cabin. But there were no neighbors for miles, and no one in their right mind would be out in a blizzard like this just to scare a stranger. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that whatever was outside wasn't following the rules of logic or survival. It was as if the storm itself had birthed a shadow to haunt me. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the curtains, the sounds outside finally died down, replaced by a haunting stillness. The wind had calmed to a whisper, and the heavy snowfall had turned into light, drifting flakes that sparkled in the dim light. I stayed in my chair, still clutching the fireplace poker, afraid that the silence was just another trap to lure me outside. My eyes were burning, and my body ached from the tension. But I didn't dare close my eyes for even a second. I waited for hours, watching the shadows retract as the sun rose. Around 8 in the morning, I heard the sound of an engine approaching. A real, mechanical sound that brought a surge of hope to my heart. I looked through the window and saw a large 4x4 truck plowing through the deep snow, stopping right behind my car. A man in a heavy winter parka stepped out, carrying a thermos and a clipboard, looking like the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. I practically threw myself at the door, fumbling with the locks to let him in, desperate for human contact and the safety it provided. I was finally no longer alone in this place. The man was a cabin attendant, sent by the rental company to check on me after the storm had knocked out the local phone lines. He looked surprised to see me in such a state, disheveled and wildered, still holding the fireplace poker in my white-knuckled grip. I started rambling immediately, telling him about the car alarm, the figure in the snow, the knocking, and the footprints. I pointed toward the door and the window, my voice shaking as I described the terror I had endured throughout the long, dark night. I just wanted him to tell me that everything was going to be okay. The attendant listened patiently, his expression shifting from concern to a strange, mask-like neutrality as I finished my story. He didn't look at the windows or the door. He just looked at me with a sort of pitying confusion that made my stomach churn. He set his thermos down on the table and took a slow breath, looking around the small cabin as if searching for the right words to say. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sounds of the night before, and I felt a cold dread beginning to pool in my gut once again as I waited for him to speak. "Sir," he finally said, his voice low and steady, "I think the isolation might be getting to you. And I truly understand how scary these storms can be. He told me that he had been the only one on these roads for the last 24 hours, and that the snow was too deep for anyone to travel on foot. He explained that the car alarm was probably triggered by a short circuit caused by the extreme cold and moisture getting into the electronics. It sounded so logical and calm. But I knew what I had seen with my own 2 eyes. And I knew that the sounds I heard weren't just the wind. I walked him to the front door, wanting to show him the footprints that I had seen earlier through the peephole. But when we stepped outside onto the porch, my heart sank into my shoes as I looked down at the pristine, white surface. The snow was smooth and undisturbed, with no sign of any footprints leading